Let's talk about football and gender nonconformism. That's right, it's Discworld time. Cheers. Welcome back, everybody, to me talking about books, and not just any books, but Discworld books, and not just all of them, but one in particular, and that is number 37, Unseen Academicals. As I said, the 37th in publication order, and a wizard book. And a football book, and so much more. And we'll do the usual thing, which is me giving you a quick synopsis, telling you why you have to, for God's sake, read that book, which you have. And then we'll talk a bit about details, about the things that stand out to me, why I think it's a really good book, what happens in it, and so forth, which will contain some spoilers. So I'll give you a quick note, and, just read the book, all right, okay? Anyway, let's get started and talk about Unseen Academicals. All right, I already said this. It's number 37 in publication order. It involves the Wizards, and it involves the game of football in Ankh-Morpork and how it changes over time, because Ankh-Morpork changes over time. So I think compared to a lot of other Wizard books, you can read this one without having read all of the others previous Wizard novels before that. It does, of course, help. It has a lot of callbacks to older books, but you can basically read this as a standalone, like almost all of the other Discworld novels, so you can do that. If you're interested in football, it may be a book for you. If you like the Wizards, it may be a book for you. If you're into, I don't know, high fashion, it may be a book for you. It does, like always, deal with a lot of, social commentary, the idea of progress, the idea of, liberalism in a lot of ways, the idea of moving forward, becoming a more open society. A lot of these themes, and they're all tied together with, sports and mass culture in a lot of ways. I really appreciated this book. I had some struggles with it when I read it for the first time, because it came out really shortly after Terry Pratchett made his Alzheimer's diagnosis public, and at the time, it's very much like me trying to figure out whether the book has already suffered from him being sick, which is, not how you should approach these things, but I was young back then, and I was still shocked back then, and so this time around, I tried to not think about the fact that this is, we're reaching the end of this ongoing Discworld read-along that has only 4 books left, which is, 4 books? Yeah, 4 books left, and that's depressing and frightening, because we've been doing this for like 2.5 years, almost 3 years now, and that's a long time. And knowing that there will be only 4 left, it's a bit depressing, is I guess the right word here. So yeah, that did certainly paint my reading experience this time around, but I think I like it much more now than I did it back when it came out, and that's a good thing. And yeah, so I've told you what to expect. Go read the goddamn book. It's really good. And it is the longest Discworld novel, so you'll get a whole lot of disc for very little money. Well, not that little money, but you know what I mean. Anyway, go read it, and now let's talk about themes and stuff that I found great in it. All right. Let's talk about culture, mass culture, sports, and the Situationists, because I'm that kind of person. All right, so as usual, we'll look at a bunch of things that come up in this book. I feel the largest one is, as I already hinted, the way it deals with culture, mass culture, and progress. And I think it does do some very clever things. I may disagree with the politics, but I think it's still worthwhile to read this and talk about it. And for that, we need to start with something. When we use the term mass culture, we have a bit of a problem, because it can be used for 2 very different things. And that is culture that comes from, the populace. I try to not to use the word masses all the time, because it feels a bit derogatory, and I try to avoid that. So there's either a culture that comes from below in society, spontaneously starts somewhere, a lot of, sports stuff, folk art, so to speak, a lot of, humor, those kind of things come from everyone. And then there is the other side, of course, which is mass culture in the negative sense, in the culture industry sense of someone like Adorno and Horkheimer, which means culture produced by the elites, by the system, to, well, keep everyone else kind of calm and distracted so they don't actually go and, take over the system and tear it down. And that's the negative sense of mass culture. So those two are unfortunately always linked linguistically, and there's a lot of confusion to be had here. Now, this book does deal with both of these, or the dynamic between those two, if we assume that sports is in fact a form of mass culture. It's a form of culture, of course it is. And what happened, especially with football, and there's a historic parallel somewhere between like the 1980s and the 2000s, obviously, in British football. I guess I don't have to say that when we're talking football, we're talking what Americans call soccer because they have no culture, not even mass culture. You know what I mean? Point is, the kind where you actually kick a round ball that has been around forever, and yeah, that one. So what happened historically is that football, with all its hooliganism, its violence, and so forth, changed into a multi-billion-dollar economy over the last 30-ish, 40 years, basically. And during that process, it became sanitized in ways that may or may not be problematic. And that's certainly the story that Unseen Academicals kind of tells. There's more to it, though, and we'll get into all of that as well. But that's one process, the way that well, football as a form of culture changes from being mass culture as culture of the masses to mass culture as culture produced for the masses. And that process usually is a process of loss in a lot of ways. Now let's go from there. And I think it's interesting to keep that in mind. Because this has happened before, and in fact it's a trend that always happens. It's a process that the situationists around Guy Debord called recuperation, which means that any form of radical movement gets recuperated by the spectacle, the society of the spectacle, whatever you want to call it, capitalism or so forth, and turned into a product that can be sold. It gets commodified. It's something that happened, well, to sports, certainly. It happened to punk rock. It happened to heavy metal. It certainly happened to hip-hop and rap music. It's a general process. The question is there a way to avoid that? Unfortunately, the jury on that one is still out. I sure hope so, but it's certainly something to be aware of whenever you start doing something that you consider as subculture, as underground, whatever you want to call it. At some point, the system will try to actually make it its own and thus take the radical impetus and tame it and sanitize it. And this happened, of course, with football. Now, the problem with football, possibly with a lot of these movements, is that there's a lot of negativity, negative aspects to that form of mass culture or those radical subcultures. With football, it's, of course, hooliganism, and we see that happening with Discworld as well, when the first part in the first football game they go to is very much about hooliganism and fighting of fans, and very much, to the detriment of the actual game as a sport, which seems to be almost not really happening because this is Discworld and we are able to ignore these things or make them even more extreme than in reality. Now, what happens in Discworld is that the system, in this case, very literally, the tyrant Lord Vetinari decides it's time to change that and tame football. And this is one of the first points where I have a bit of an issue with Unseen Academicals. It's something that we find a lot with Terry Pratchett. He's not very good at seeing the systemic implications of capitalism, because while there may be government involvement when it comes to, taming football, making rules that, change stadiums from having a lot of stands into having a lot of seats, which is one of the things that you see, especially in Britain, a lot of this is mostly driven by the need to make profit by certain parts of the capitalist system, by large capital, so to speak, and not by the decision that the conscious decision of one person in charge that wants to tame football. This is just, a small bit, because the process is still the same. It's just the question, who's to blame? And in Discworld, it's obviously Lord Vetinari. So there we have the process of recuperation of football, turning it into a business or a show business versus, having it be something outside the control of the state and government. Turning into something that is under the control of the state and government is the process that happens with Unseen Academicals. And of course, football fights back. Now, the problem is that in Pratchett's world, it's very clear that those fans or those hooligans are the bad guys. Andy Shank and his gang are the bad guys, and the new football seems to be better, objectively better than the old form of football. And that's something we'll come back to when we talk about the larger narrative of progress here. But I wanted to point out that there is some serious theory behind this and some serious history behind the plot around football. Now, of course, this gets mirrored by something else, and that is making high culture or luxury culture affordable and turning it into mass culture as well. I'm talking, of course, of fashion, because there is a second narrative going on here, which is about shatters and the micro-male discourse about Juliet becoming a model for dwarf male, and of course Glenda selling, door-to-door selling all kinds of cosmetics and so forth. The idea that luxury goods become affordable to larger parts of society, and thus turning high culture, or what you might call higher culture. I really don't like those ideas, but that's what we got to deal with today. Turning them into mass culture as well. And that, I think, mirrors the way that the culture from below football becomes acceptable to higher stratas of society, the more elites of society. The things that have only been accessible to the financial, at least, and political elites of society are becoming accessible to the less fortunate parts of society, financially less fortunate parts. Those things are in a mirror, and obviously what drives this in Discworld narratives is obviously progress. We got to talk about that progress, but I want to mention one thing that I think Pratchett is really good at. He points out that trolls and dwarfs, but mainly trolls in this discussion, have only been sort of really accepted by society once they make enough money to buy expensive goods. And I think that's a very astute observation, that all kinds of marginalized parts of society only sort of are accepted in the wider mainstream and get some sort of participation in society once they have become an economic factor. And that's kind of fucked up. Let's just stay with that. It's kind of fucked up, and Pratchett is clear about how that is kind of not a good thing. But let's talk about progress here for a moment. Because the overarching narrative, especially with these Ankh-Morpork books, is of course Lord Vetinari mostly guiding Ankh-Morpork into the future by making it a multi-species, multicultural metropolis that is very liberal in a lot of these senses, which, allows basically everything, gives people enough freedom to thrive, and that will lead to economic progress and economic benefits for everyone and so forth. That's the driving force in Pratchett's Discworld narrative behind the social progress that we see happening in Discworld. And while the observation that, having a lot of money going around and economic wealth leading to social progress is certainly there, I think there's there's something missing there that might just be rooted in Pratchett's very specific form of liberalism that we've seen in previous Discworld novels as well. And I think that's where we need to talk about the crab bucket metaphor. Now, obviously, the crab bucket is something that we've all heard of before. If you haven't, the metaphor is very simple. It's if you have crabs in a bucket, you don't need a lid on it, because if one tries to climb over the rim, the other ones are trying to pull it back down. There's obviously, reasons for that. I'm not going to go into that, but it is a metaphor that is around when it comes to people from oftentimes a marginalized group or a economically not very well off society group and so forth. If one person is trying to leave specific forms of the culture, everyone else will pull them back in. And before we move forward, I just want to mention how well Pratchett handles that metaphor, because he has Pepe call it and, talk about someone being in the crab bucket, and then he just literally shows the image like a couple of chapters later, and then takes it another point until Glenda in this case realizes what Pepe meant at the beginning. So the way he uses the crab bucket metaphor, I think, is important and shows that it is important to Pratchett. Now, obviously, Pratchett has always been about class differences and classism in a lot of ways, and poverty being enforced by, the upper classes, in his case, oftentimes aristocracy and nobility, because he's British and this is a heavily Britain-inspired world. So we see that a lot happening here. But with the crab bucket metaphor, I think what happens is that Pratchett, for the first time, very explicitly talks about how it is internalized classism that keeps a lot of people back. Now, of course, he's mentioned that before when he talks about Cockbill Street and people, being very poor, but trying to use a little money they have to keep up appearances and so forth. But this time around, it's very much about how it's in everyone's head that they can't actually leave, and that it would not be a right to leave, and so forth. And that leads them to hold their friends back as well, which is, of course, with Glenda and Juliet. When Juliet gets the chance to become a model, that Glenda goes, no, she's got to do this very honest job here, because at least that's steady and so forth. And I think there is something to that. The problem that I see with Pratchett here, once again, is a problem of a focus on individualism, a heavy focus on individualism. I think that's something that might be tied to Pratchett as someone from a very poor background, making it on his own. When you read his biography and stuff like that, he understands that he's made it on his own terms and so forth. He's thought his way through all of that, and that leads to a bit of a survivor bias, I think, which means that while Glenda overcomes the idea of the internalized classism and helps Juliet and gets her own thing at the same time, sort of on her own terms, it kind of neglects the fact that a lot of this is still systemic, and not just, if everyone would stop thinking themselves small, suddenly everyone would get along and have, all the money and all the success they want. That's a very simplistic narrative, a very neoliberal narrative that I personally struggle with. And yeah, I see where it's coming from. I think it could have been handled better, but then again, we're talking about like a 400-page book, and it's packing a lot of stuff in there. And Pratchett does, of course, move beyond that. I just wanted to point out that idea that he overemphasizes individual agency and individual overcoming one's prejudices and internalized issues, and that will make basically everything possible. Because that's obviously not how society works. Because society is still very much prejudiced against you. Which brings us, obviously, to the other person who needs to overcome prejudice, society's prejudice, and possibly his own, and that is Nut the Orc. See, Nut is, obviously, and that leads us to, the whole worth discussion. Nut has to overcome everyone else's prejudice, but they do because he proves worthy, and society understands that. And that idea that you can convince an entire group of people of your own quality and and make them respect you. Yeah, that's where I think the systemic element gets kind of overlooked or oversimplified with Pratchett. What Nut, however, does, or Nut's storyline, however, does, that I personally appreciate, is the idea of the questions like, how do you decide your own worth? Where comes self-esteem? Where self-esteem comes from? Who gets to judge whether we are, good or not? Now, obviously, I personally believe that every person has worth just by existing as a person. But there is certainly something to be said for the ideas like that we all should strive to leave the world a better place than we found it. And that part I understand and I appreciate. And the way that Nut is shown as in doubt, because people have impressed this on him the entire time. I go like, yeah, well, but you have to show us that you're worth it because you're, part of the orcs and not a human or a troll or whatever. And how that can twist someone, I think that's once again where Pratchett shows that he's really good at observing humanity and how the pressures we put on ourselves can twist us, is that conflict between Glenda, who thinks that Nut is, well, Nut is worth respect and everything just by being Nut, versus Lady Margolotta, who thinks that it's important to, drive Nut to become that better person. Now, obviously, it's clear that Margolotta the vampire does have a larger goal there, with, Nut taking over and helping the orcs into a general society. We see that idea that, people need, or groups need to sort of actively join the multi-species society of Discworld on their own terms and so forth, but I see it's important to see that, how Pratchett shows that Margolotta does this for good motives, but during those motives she does very much damage Nut the person, and Glenda sees that. So the scene near the end when Nut goes and asks, have I have worth? And Glenda goes and says, you've always had worth. That's an important point there. It may just come a bit too late, or be not emphasized enough for my personal taste, but it is there, and I think it does work. So the overall message, or the overall idea, that while Discworld is moving forward, it leads to a more open society. That I think is something I really appreciate, the way that Pratchett uses the metaphor of football to show how said progress oftentimes comes at a loss, and leads to, the whole form of culture that was the people's and not those above's, is then taken over by people like C.M.O.T. Dibbler, who wants to make money by the state dictating stuff, and taking something away that was the common people's. He does point that out, and I think that's valid and very valuable. The way that old football is seen as really sort of nostalgic, but also kind of bad, while the new is supposed to be good, that I think is a bit too clear cut for my personal taste. However, the bonus side of this form of individualism, so to speak, is that Pratchett makes it very clear that we all can decide who we want to be, and make it on our own and be who we want to be, which leads us to Pepe, the person who decides to be a dwarf and possibly other things, and that wonderful line when they talk about pronouns, which Pratchett obviously with the dwarfs has always done, and Madame Shan says, as a dwarf I am king, and as a king I declare that I am a queen. That part, really cool. And then when she talks about Pepe, it's Pepe is Pepe, he, she, labels are so meaningless. And that, you know what? Respect to Terry Pratchett to actually call that out in 2008. That's pretty fucking good. I like that. It probably annoyed some people. I just found it nice to have that idea in there, that what counts is what we ourselves believe, who we are, who we want to be, and we can be that, and society should just accept and respect that. That is obviously the positive side of a focus on the individual and the rights of the individual. The downside is, of course, that in that form of individualism that Pratchett brings to the table, it also means that there is the sole responsibility is on the individual, and that's something that when we come to the crab bucket narrative kind of shows through, because while that internalized classism is definitely there, there's still a lot of external classism out there as well, and we need to overcome that as well and dismantle that, and that's not something we can do by just thinking our way out of it. So there's some good and there's some bad in that regard in this book. I think it's, once again, for a comedy about football, it has an astonishing level of depth and societal analysis, and I appreciated that much more than I did when I first read it. So there's that. Let's talk about, a bunch of jokes and other things that I found just fun and cool. We already spoken about the fact that in the last couple of Discworld novels, stuff gets way more integrated, and this happens again in here. I very much found it fascinating that even Hwell, the dwarven Shakespeare playwright from Weird Sisters, which is book number 6, all the way back 31 books ago, gets another mention here just on the side. Rincewind showed up, and it's always cool to have Rincewind show up. The luggage showed up for a moment. Those things are just really nice. And there's a lot of these references to all kinds of people. Pastor Oates, whom we met in Carpe Jugulum shows up as a priest. The fact that his battle axe is called Forgiveness, I just really love that joke, man. That's just a really cool stuff. There's some things where I'm not sure how I stand on that. The idea of throwing a banana to the librarian on when they're playing football. See, throwing bananas has often been, a very racist thing football fans have done. Obviously, the the librarian is an ape, so it all kind of makes sense, but it can be read in the wrong way. On the other hand, that banana is obviously poisoned, so maybe you can read it as a metaphor for, poisoned racism, I guess. I just wanted to, point that part out because I think it's important not to forget that some of these jokes are contextual, and if you're not aware of all of the context, they can land sort of wrong. There's a bunch of other jokes that I really found just really funny. The fact that there is a teddy bear that has 3 eyes because of a sewing accident, and is thus more enlightened than other teddy bears, which is a Yogi Bear joke, and it took me a while to get that one. There's others in there that I just, bits and pieces and jokes, as always with Discworld, that make the whole thing just feel very, very Discworld-ish, without, being bad in any way. The fact that we have, stuff like stamps, recent history in Discworld actually showing up again and again, that consistency in the world building that we didn't have in earlier books continues here. The conversations between Ridcully and, of course, the new college of Braceneck, where the dean is now arch-chancellor, the conflict between, the rivalry between the different faculties, which may lead to college sports in the future, or obviously the competitions between Oxford and Cambridge in England. Stuff was well done. The idea of having wizard collectible cards from cigarettes, nice one, right there. There's obviously a lot of these kind of bits and pieces and jokes in here that I very much appreciate in every Discworld novel. And Unseen Academicals has all of them. So, is it a good one? I think at the end of the day, yes. It is still a very good one. I'm not a football fan, so some of the football stuff just doesn't really interest me that much. So yeah, but overall it does pack a lot of meaning. It does still keep a lot of the Discworld humor, and there was nothing that really annoyed me like in some older Discworld novels. So all in all, this is still a really good Discworld novel, and possibly a highlight this late in. We'll continue with the read-along, obviously, next time round with I Shall Wear Midnight, which is another Tiffany Aching book. So if you want to join us, we'll be talking about that one on the Unabridged Bonus Discord in January. So you have some time to catch up on Tiffany Aching novels if you feel like it. I'd love to have you there. Let me know what you think about Unseen Academicals down in the comments. Like, subscribe, I don't know, join the Patreon, do all the wonderful things that may or may not make this world a better place. I'll see you very soon in a conversation about something else. And until then, I don't know, kick or be kicked, I guess. Anyway, cheers.